Hello, my name's Evan, and thanks for checking out my History of Comic Book Movies, Part 1, with this video covering the comic book films of the 1940s and 1950s. So some brief background. What we think of today as comic books were basically created in 1933, but their popularity really took off in 1938 with the creation of Superman, the first superhero. So it was only 3 years later, in 1941, when we have our actual first comic book adaptation for a film. And that is when Captain Marvel, published by Fawcett Comics, got a movie. Captain Marvel had actually been created only 2 years earlier in 1939. So in 41, Public Pictures started making a serial called The Adventures of Captain Marvel. Now, for those who don't know what a serial is, it's basically a collection of short films that tell an ongoing story in episodes, kind of like a season of a TV show is now today. So, interestingly enough, Republic Pictures had actually tried to make a Superman movie, but DC, or as they were called at the time, National Periodical Publication, refused. So, the Captain Marvel serial was 12 chapters. It was directed by John English and William Whitney. Compared to many of the comic book serials that followed, the production values actually weren't that bad, and the film's not that cheesy. It's obviously not as good as a high-budget production at the time, but not terrible either. The title character was portrayed by Tom Tyler, who had appeared in some John Ford westerns. Now, there were actually some characters that were created just for the movie that eventually found their way into the comics. And this, as you'll see, is the first of many examples of comic book adaptations affecting the source material itself. So if you want to check the serial out, it's on YouTube currently. In both the serial and the comics, Captain Marvel's alter ego was Billy Batson, who gets his powers from an old wizard named Shazam and must say the name Shazam to transform into Captain Marvel, which is also true in the comics. In the 1970s, Captain Marvel was bought by DC and integrated into the DC universe. Also in 1941, we have the most influential comic book adaptation of the era, the cartoon serial based on Superman by Fleischer Studios, who were already famous for making Popeye and Betty Boop cartoons. They made 8 episodes of Superman, the first of which even got nominated for an Oscar. The next and final 8 episodes were made by famous studios, with the serial coming to completion in 1943. In the serial, Superman fought a variety of villains, including robots, dinosaurs, and even Nazis. The Superman cartoons were notable for being one of the earliest uses of the rotoscoping technique, where animation is placed over live-action footage. This method would later be used by filmmakers like Ralph Bakshi and Richard Linklater, who you may know from directing Boyhood and Dazed and Confused. He used rotoscoping in A Scanner Darkly and Waking Life. The Superman serial also contained the first use of the famous lines, "faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound." So the cartoon shorts, they were actually very influential on the character in the comics. They were the first time Superman could fly. Prior to that, he was just a really good jumper. Next year, in 1942, the Fawcett Comics character Spy Smasher was the basis of a Republic serial, which ended up having 12 chapters. The character of Spy Smasher first appeared in 1940. He used a vehicle with the awesome name of the Gyro Sub that travels through the air as well as underwater. After World War II ended, he became Crime Smasher. Fortunately, Fawcett stopped publishing all superhero comics in the early 1950s. In 1972, DC bought the rights to all the Fawcett comic characters, including Spy Smasher. Spy Smasher and the other Fawcett characters were designated to be part of the DC multiverse on Earth S. As was kind of uncommon for this era, the Spy Smasher serial featured a villain that was actually from the comics, called The Mask. They did make some changes, such as giving Spy Smasher a twin brother. Spy Smasher basically functioned as wartime propaganda, and the serial actually begins with him getting captured in Nazi-occupied Paris. Then, in 1943, we actually have the earliest portrayal of Batman on film in a serial made by Columbia Pictures, which is currently available on YouTube. Batman in this is played by a man named Lewis Wilson. Robin and Alfred both appear, so at least the basics are true to the source material. Batman and Robin look pretty goofy in their costumes, but I guess they're somewhat faithful to the comics at the time. Unfortunately, there's no Batmobile, which IMDb trivia says is because of budget problems, and instead they just use a Cadillac. The IMDb trivia also states that many changes were the result of censorship. For example, instead of being vigilantes, as we commonly think of them as, Batman and Robin are FBI agents. And not only that, actually none of the villains from the comics could appear. Despite that, the Batman serial also introduced some elements that would eventually become iconic parts of the Batman character, such as what was then known as the Bat's Cave. In episode 2 of the serial, Batman and Robin bring a gangster back to the Bat's Cave, which is literally just an actual cave with a desk in it. There are some bats flying around, and they get the criminal to talk simply by threatening to leave him alone with the bats. The gangster said he was hired by a guy named Smith, and Batman responds, completely deadpan, "That name sounds phony." The serial also, unfortunately, contained some rather crude racial stereotypes of Japanese people. The villain, Dr. Daka, is a white actor in Asian makeup that claims to serve Hirohito and has just a terrible fake accent. And there's plenty of racial slurs used as well. The year after that, in 1944, we have the first adaptation of a Marvel character, Captain America. The serial would be the only theatrical adaptation of a Marvel character until Howard the Duck in 1986. In the serial, Captain America's identity is not Steve Rogers, but rather Grant Gardner. He also wears an incredibly lame-looking costume, even for the times. Moving on to 1946, we have a 15-chapter serial about a DC character named Hop Harrigan. Hop was created by John Blummer, and he wasn't really a superhero per se, as he had no powers and didn't wear a costume. He was just a really good pilot who had fought in World War II. The serial stars William Bakewell as Harrigan, and according to Al Rovi, in the serial, Hop fights an insane professor named Dr. Tobor. In 1947, there was a serial based on the DC character The Vigilante, directed by Wallace Fox and released by Columbia Pictures. It starred Ralph Byrd as the titular character, a singing cowboy who also fought crime on his motorcycle. In the comics, the Vigilante had a sidekick who was a young Chinese boy, but in the serial, this character was changed to be white. The Vigilante first appeared in the comics in 1938, and even went on to appear in Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1985, as well as cartoons such as Justice League Unlimited and Batman the Brave and the Bold. The year after that, in 1948, Superman was portrayed in live action for the first time by Kirk Allen. The 15-part serial was directed by Spencer Gordon Bennett, who would also direct next year the Batman and Robin serial, as well it was co-directed by Thomas Carr, who would go on to direct Congo Bill with Bennett, another comic book movie. And this Superman serial was distributed by Columbia Pictures. That same year, in 1948, another DC hero was given his own serial, Congo Bill. Bill first appeared in 1940, and in the 50s would go on to become known as Congorilla, and even become a member of the Justice League at one point. In the serial, Bill is an adventurer that must rescue a missing girl in Africa. 1949 saw the 15-chapter Batman and Robin serial released by Columbia. It featured Commissioner Gordon for what I believe to be the first time on film, as well as comic character Vicky Vale. Sadly, the film was quite low budget, And, it really could have been pretty interesting to see a 1940s filmed version of Batman if done right with a good budget. The costume, like in previous serials, looks pretty goofy. There are several continuity errors, and the whole thing just looks cheap. Moving on to the 1950s. In 1950, there was a serial called Atom Man vs. Superman that was released. That was actually a sequel to the 1948 serial, so it kept Kirk Alyn as Superman and Bennett as the director. Interesting fact, this film actually contained the first filmed portrayal of Lex Luthor by an actor named Lyle Talbot. Then in 1951, we have the first full-length movie based on a comic book character, Superman and the Mole Men. Now, it was only 58 minutes, but still, technically, it qualifies as a full-length. It wasn't a serial. George Reeves starred as Superman, as he would in the television series that came out next year. The show aired until 1957 and spawned a TV movie titled Stamp Day for Superman, which sounds just thrilling. Finally, in 1952, a serial was made based on the Quality Comics character Blackhawk. This would be the last theatrically released serial based on a comic. It was also released by Columbia Pictures and starred Kirk Alyn as Blackhawk. Spencer Gordon Bennett again directed, this time with Fred F. Sears. The Blackhawk comics were published continuously from 1941 to 68, first by Quality, then by DC. There were also a few short series with the character printed in the 60s and 70s. So by the mid-1950s, serials were dying out. They were no longer really commonly made. This basically meant the end of superhero and comic book films for the time being. This would basically be the case until the mid-1960s, which I will hopefully get to in the next video. Thanks for watching.